Hey, welcome back. I'm just going to continue then, more or less where we left off. We're going to just try to elaborate a little more, hopefully clarify some of these questions about induction and so on with Hume, basically, because it can seem to kind of confound some fairly, deeply held assumptions, or something can seem confusing about it. But honestly, it's not that confusing once you see it in the right light. So here's just a quick summary of what we did before, basically. He's interested in thinking about cause and effect. The only way we understand matters of fact, basically the concrete world around us, is by understanding how stuff works, what causes what. It's only in that way that we can ever form reliable predictions about things, and that's just a very useful thing to do. Now he wants to say our knowledge of this only comes from the patterns we experience. When, over time, over a course of time, we see that one kind of thing is regularly followed by another. That's this constant conjunction idea. That can seem kind of blasé and not that interesting, but it's really the heart and soul of this whole argument here. The point being is that we never, ever directly perceive something causing something else. We never really see anything causing something. We just see one thing being followed by another. We only see sequences of events, and then when we step back and notice a pattern over time, that's when we start to think that the first of those pairs of things is somehow actually causing, right? It's the reason why the second one happens at all. Otherwise, there's only lots of stuff happening, right? Otherwise, there's only things in sequence with no special connection between some of them, namely a causal connection. So we only see that when we see the pattern. So the point being then, we never perceive the actual cause. We have no direct empirical evidence or experience, say, perceptual experience of a cause. But that is what we're interested in. So then when we do engage in inductive inference, and just by way of reminder, this is something each and every one of us does millions of times every day, basically. We form an expectation based on past experience. There is something surprising about this when we think about it in the way Hume is asking us to do, and that is, well, it's not actually as say, eminently rational as we might have thought. We shouldn't stop doing it. He's never going to say that. But the idea is, if you like, somewhat crudely, you can say it is a bit of an educated guess in a sense, right? Precisely because we have no direct perceptual experience of actual causes. So in a sense, to substitute for that, we make this assumption, right? We have to assume, right, that patterns will continue, basically. Now, we can put that, I think, more precisely by saying we have to assume the same cause will have the same effect. That's what we have to assume. And if you have to assume something in life, that's a pretty good thing to assume, basically. There's lots of weirder things that somebody could assume. There's nothing weird at all about that. It only becomes weird when we connect it to the observation that, well, we never directly perceive causes. So that's why it basically takes the form of this assumption, right? Things might appear to us, they might appear to our perception to be the same, even if more deeply, in reality, they're different. And that's the simple explanation as to why, even when we form what we think are extremely reliable predictions, sometimes they don't come to pass. Sometimes we are surprised. Everything appeared the same, but unless we're prepared to imagine that, say, reality now functions differently, that's a weird thing, right? Then what we have to say is that, well, actually something must have been different, but we failed to notice it because of the limitations of our perception. And that's just something we have to live with, basically. We have to live with our knowledge, our empirical knowledge. Even though it's very good, it's not perfect and never will be. So anyway, that's what we were looking at before, just the fact that we do make this assumption, and this assumption remains forever unprovable. And that's the most fascinating thing about this, because the only way you could lend any kind of rational support to it would be by making it the conclusion of an inductive argument, But the point is, it is always a premise in any inductive argument. And again, you see that most clearly when you recognize that as soon as you stop making that assumption, then it makes zero sense to turn to the past as a guide to the future. It is only when we assume same cause, same effect, or otherwise assume that reality works the same way tomorrow as it does today and yesterday, right? Basically that natural laws don't change. We just have to come to terms with the fact that we never have a perfect awareness of just what those are. Right? We might believe that deep down there is this regularity in reality. It's a very reasonable thing to assume, but we always will just have to make that assumption, and making that assumption is the basis of empirical reasoning. It's the only thing that makes it make sense for us to turn our attention to past experience as a guide to the future. So just here's an example, right? This is Old Faithful, so it's a perfect example because its name kind of tells us this is a very faithful, recurring pattern. It's a geyser in, I think, Yellowstone Park, wherever. I think it's in Wyoming. It regularly erupts. It's not exact, but here's some information about it. Anyway, the idea here is, well, here's a pattern, right? And we come to expect it. People travel to go see this, of course. They expect the pattern to continue, even though, at least for the vast majority of us, we have no clue why this happens, right? It's all happening underground. So that's supposed to represent the way our perception in general is limited. We don't see the causes of this eruption of the geyser. We just see it happen on a fairly regular basis. Now, of course, some people study this and they have a better idea what's going on underground. But in any case, right, it could very well happen, and presumably it will one day. It's going to stop. Right? Or the pattern will change considerably. People will have traveled a long way and be very disappointed. They won't see it. Right? And in that situation, they have basically two broad ways to go. They can either say that the history of the eruptions of Old Faithful was just an enormous long string of coincidences. There was never any good reason for it to expect it. That's weird. Right? Or, more likely, they will just say, well, unbeknownst to us, something is different. There is a causal factor somewhere underground, who knows, or upstream, who knows what's going on down there. Something is different. And this can lead us, or those scientists who study this, it will lead them or motivate them to take a closer look and try to develop a more comprehensive understanding of it so that we won't be surprised again in the future. Of course, we will be for some other way. That's just basically how it goes. We try, when our expectations are foiled, we try then to take a closer look, figure out what was different, even though we didn't notice it at the time, and then try to build that into our understanding so that our predictions can be at least a little bit better next time. Again, the alternative to doing that is to somehow imagine that actually everything just happens more or less randomly, that everything is just a coincidence, and there was never a good reason to expect anything to happen. But that's just too weird for most people, basically. We want to say, no, there's good reasons why that pattern happened. Likewise, there must be some good reason why it didn't happen on this occasion, and let's just look into it and see what's going on. Here's some other just quick kind of examples, basically. Here's something you might do if you're cooking pasta, basically. I was just doing this. And basically the idea is you want to test your noodles. You want to know when they're done. It may be very important. And typically people can do that in different ways, however you might test a noodle. But that's what you do. You test a noodle, maybe two. You don't test them all. Then they wouldn't have any dinner. But the idea is when you test one or maybe two, and if it's done, this is what you've done in the past, and it seems to have worked, it's going to happen someday that even though the noodle passes the cooked test, maybe the whole pot is not evenly cooked, or there's some other problem, right? Patterns can fail to continue, and again, you're either in the situation where you say, well, maybe it was just always entirely coincidental that test seemed to work in the past, really had nothing to do with whether the noodles were done or not. Or you say, well, something must be different this time. Maybe it's a different brand, maybe the water was different, who knows, but you'll take a closer look and try to figure it out. right? Generally, we don't want to let go of the assumption that same cause leads to the same effect, right? That's far too important to let go of. We want to hold on to that and rather say there just must have been some cause involved this time that we didn't notice, and we need to try to take a closer look, basically. So some other kinds of examples. Here's something that's going on. We got flu, we got coronavirus going on. Basically, people could have profiles, right? Symptoms, right? The idea of symptoms, flu-like symptoms, can be signs of any number of conditions, basically. Someone can go into a clinic and during flu season and be sent home and be told they just have the flu and so on. Sometimes it could be something considerably more serious, and that's very unfortunate when that happens, right? But the idea is, well, we don't really see, the underlying causes of these symptoms. I mean, it's possible to conduct very detailed tests. That's often not done in every case of a possible flu patient. In the current situation, things might be a little bit different, but basically there, right, sometimes we might rethink, right, the way things go, right, when we usually engage in inductive inference and form a certain conclusion. There are times like this where that may be more problematic, and that's just what some of these other examples are supposed to try to show. Right? Things like this, whether or not, your grades in a course should just be based on past performance. Most people would say, of course not, that's ridiculous. But you'd be surprised at how many people actually think maybe that's the way it ought to go, right? Somebody who's always gotten A's could just say, let's just save ourselves the trouble and give me the A. Or everybody could just get as their final grade, their midterm grades. Some people might be very happy, others not. But in general, we know that doesn't really hold up. That here, likewise, sometimes inductive inference isn't exactly the way we would necessarily want to go, right? Likewise, in situations like this, if you're trying to get home, and somebody who regularly drives kind of buzzed, for example, but they say they've never had an accident, right? So inductive inference in the sense would suggest that it would be quite safe, that pattern would continue. You might be more inclined to think, no, that was a very fortunate string of coincidences, and I see no reason to expect it to continue. The last thing I was going to talk about is just the weather, because it's a very common example where we have inductive inference. We're always wondering if it's going to rain tomorrow and so on, and it's often expressed in a form like this, some sort of percentage, say, and we might wonder, what does that mean exactly? What does that mean, basically? It doesn't mean there's anything chancy, right? Meteorology is a science, and in fact, it's a very good example of one from Hume's perspective, I think, just because the conclusions that it draws tend to take forms like this in very clearly probabilistic terms, right? Less certainty, because it's very hard to predict the weather, actually. But basically, what this is telling us is that people don't really know what causes rain. All they know is all the factors that they consider causally relevant, all the things that we can measure in current conditions. We can do that. We can then turn to whatever historical database of weather records that we have, basically see what days are just like today, and then basically see what happened on the next day in each of those cases. Basically, we basically say, well, 6 out of 10 times it rained. 4 out of 10 it didn't. That just tells us we never know exactly what causes rain. Unless we're prepared, and nobody really is, unless we're prepared to say that rain is an entirely random event. Nobody thinks that. It's just complicated. We don't actually know all the causally relevant factors. If we did, our predictions would always be much closer to 100%. The fact that they're not just shows that we don't yet fully know what causes rain, right? We do pretty well. We try to measure what we think is relevant and so on, compare it to the past, and draw the conclusion, right? If, we try to improve it, we try to take into account things that we hadn't in the past, things like El Nino, for example, or other things like the Gulf Stream, the jet stream, whatever, different things that in the past people didn't take into account, so that we can raise those numbers. But that's just a really good example of what's going on. Basically, the point with Hume is not that we ever question whether or not there are causes underlying things. The question just really is, what is causally relevant? That's what we don't really know, and that's what the business of science is trying to figure out.